In 1852, a small book by an unknown woman would shake the foundations of American society and help spark the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history. This is the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and how a work of fiction became one of the most powerful political weapons in American history. Part 1. The setting. The year was 1850. America stood at a crossroads. The Compromise of 1850 had temporarily preserved the Union, but at a terrible cost. The new Fugitive Slave Act required all Americans to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. For many in the North, this law crossed a moral line they could no longer ignore. In Brunswick, Maine, a 39-year-old mother and wife named Harriet Beecher Stowe read the news with growing horror. Born into a family of prominent abolitionists, Stowe had witnessed slavery firsthand during her years in Cincinnati, Ohio. But the Fugitive Slave Act would transform her from a concerned observer into one of America's most influential writers. Part 2. Stowe's Mission. Stowe later recalled the moment her mission became clear. Sitting in church one Sunday, she experienced what she described as a vision of an elderly slave being beaten to death while maintaining his Christian faith. This vision would become the climactic scene of her novel. As she would later write, "I feel now that the time is come when even a woman or a child who can speak a word for freedom and humanity is bound to speak." Stowe didn't set out to write the great American novel. She set out to save souls and change minds. She believed that if she could make slavery real for Northern readers, if she could put a human face on this abstract political issue, she could move the conscience of a nation. Part 3. The writing process. Stowe threw herself into research with the dedication of a scholar. She interviewed escaped slaves, studied plantation accounts, and drew upon her own experiences with domestic staff who had fled bondage. She was determined that every detail in her novel would ring true. In June 1851, Uncle Tom's Cabin began appearing as a serial in the National Era, an anti-slavery newspaper. What Stowe intended as a brief story grew into a 40-chapter novel. Readers were captivated. They wrote to the newspaper demanding to know what happened next. They shared copies with friends and family. Part 4. Publication success. On March 20th, 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin was published as a book. The response was unprecedented. The first edition of 5,000 copies sold out in 2 days. Within a year, 300,000 copies had been sold in America alone. In Britain, 1.5 million copies flew off the shelves. No book in American history had ever had such an immediate and widespread impact. Uncle Tom's Cabin became a cultural phenomenon. People weren't just reading it, they were talking about it, arguing about it, being changed by it. Part 5. Southern opposition. In the South, the reaction was swift and furious. Southern newspapers denounced the book as abolitionist propaganda. Pro-slavery writers rushed to publish rebuttals with titles like Uncle Robin and His Cabin and Aunt Phyllis's Cabin. The South accused Stowe of spreading lies and endangering the Union. Southern critics declared, "Mrs. Stowe has shamelessly traduced the South and its institutions. Her book is a work of malicious fiction designed to incite servile insurrection and dissolve our blessed Union." Part 6. Lincoln enters the story. Meanwhile, in Springfield, Illinois, a prairie lawyer named Abraham Lincoln was watching these developments with great interest. Lincoln had long opposed slavery, calling it a monstrous injustice, but he was also a pragmatist who believed in preserving the Union above all else. Lincoln was walking a political tightrope. He opposed slavery's expansion, but wasn't ready to call for immediate abolition. Stowe's book created a new climate of opinion that would eventually push Lincoln toward a more radical position. Part 7. Political transformation. Uncle Tom's Cabin did more than sell books. It changed votes. In the 1852 election, the Free Soil Party, which opposed slavery's expansion, saw its support surge in areas where the book was most popular. The novel had transformed an abstract political issue into a deeply personal moral crusade. By 1854, when Stephen Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which could extend slavery into new territories, Northern opposition was fierce and immediate. Stowe's book had prepared the ground for this reaction. Part 8. Lincoln's Awakening. The Kansas-Nebraska Act marked a turning point for Lincoln. He returned to politics with a new urgency. declaring that slavery was not just wrong, but a threat to American democracy itself. While there's no direct evidence that Lincoln read Uncle Tom's Cabin at this time, its influence permeated the political atmosphere he now entered. As Lincoln would declare, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel." Part 9. The Road to War. As the 1850s progressed, the country grew increasingly divided. Violence erupted in Kansas. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry shocked the nation, and through it all, Uncle Tom's Cabin continued to shape Northern opinion about slavery. When Lincoln ran for president in 1860, he did so in a country transformed by Stowe's novel. The Republican platform opposed slavery's expansion, a position that had become mainstream in the North, partly due to the book's influence. Part 10. The Legendary Meeting. The most famous story about Uncle Tom's Cabin may be apocryphal, but it captures a profound truth. According to legend, when Harriet Beecher Stowe visited the White House in November 1862, President Lincoln greeted her with these words, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Whether Lincoln actually said those words is debated by historians. What's not debated is that Uncle Tom's Cabin helped create the political and moral climate that made Lincoln's presidency possible and perhaps inevitable. Part 11. Wartime Significance. By the time Stowe visited Lincoln, the war she had helped precipitate was in its second year. Lincoln was preparing to issue the final Emancipation Proclamation, transforming a war for union into a war for freedom. During the Civil War, Uncle Tom's Cabin took on new meaning. Union soldiers carried copies in their packs. The book's Christian message of redemption through suffering resonated with a nation enduring unprecedented carnage. For many Union soldiers, especially those from rural backgrounds, Stowe's novel provided their first real understanding of what slavery meant for African American families. It helped them see the war as a moral crusade, not just a political conflict. Part 12. Emancipation. When Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, he acknowledged that the war's meaning had evolved. What began as a conflict to preserve the Union had become a war to fulfill America's founding promise that all men are created equal. As Lincoln declared, "In giving a freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve." Part 13. Stowe's Reflection. Stowe continued writing throughout the war and beyond, but nothing would match the impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin. She had achieved something remarkable. She had written a novel that helped change the course of history. As she reflected later in life, "I wrote what I did because, as a woman, as a mother, I was oppressed and heartbroken with the sorrows and injustice I saw, because as a Christian, I felt the dishonor to Christianity." Part 14. Lincoln's Legacy. Lincoln would not live to see slavery's complete abolition, but his assassination only strengthened the resolve to complete Reconstruction. Stowe's book had helped create the moral framework that made emancipation possible, and Lincoln's leadership had made it reality. Part 15. Lasting Impact. Modern scholars debate aspects of Stowe's characterizations, but her book's historical impact remains undeniable. It proved that literature could be a force for social change, that a single voice could help transform a nation's conscience. Uncle Tom's Cabin became a global phenomenon, translated into dozens of languages. It influenced anti-slavery movements worldwide and helped shape international opinion about American slavery. Part 16. Lessons for Today. The partnership between Harriet Beecher Stowe's moral vision and Abraham Lincoln's political leadership offers timeless lessons about how change happens in American democracy. Stowe showed that literature could shape public opinion, while Lincoln demonstrated how political leadership could translate moral convictions into law. What Stowe and Lincoln both understood was that slavery wasn't just a political issue, it was a moral crisis that demanded both emotional and intellectual responses. Stowe provided the emotion, Lincoln provided the leadership. Conclusion. In the end, Uncle Tom's Cabin reminds us of literature's power to change hearts and minds. Harriet Beecher Stowe, armed only with pen and paper, helped set in motion the forces that would end American slavery. Abraham Lincoln, reading the political winds that Stowe had helped shape, provided the leadership necessary to make freedom a reality. Together, they proved that in America, the pen truly can be mightier than the sword, especially when wielded by those brave enough to challenge injustice no matter the cost. As Stowe once wrote, "The bitterest tears shed over graves are for words left unsaid and deeds left undone." Before starting the story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.